Praise the Lord. We're going to read Isaiah chapter 2, 3 to 10. This is the millennium reign compared to the days of Israel's forsaking of God. And it says, And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. Therefore thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east, and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. Their land also is full of silver and gold, neither is there any end of their treasures. Their land is also full of horses, neither is there any end of their chariots. Their land also is full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made, and the mean man boweth down, and the great man humbleth himself. Therefore forgive them not. Enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty. Again, in reading verse number 3, it says, And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. And he will teach us of his ways, and we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. This seems to be during the millennial reign of Christ. For today, during the church age, nations are not seen going up to Jerusalem to worship God in spirit and in truth there. Further, the church has its roots in many nations of the world, and during the millennial reign of Christ, of course, and with Christ present on earth, the nations would delight to see him, that is, when he returns, and learn from him, just like Israel did when he was present during his earthly ministry. However, this is when he had returned to reign over the nations of the world. And at that time, the nations will desire to go up to the mountain of the Lord. And that means where Jesus will be present, teaching his paths. During the time of Christ's ministry on earth, also, it was not that people from all other nations had come to worship Christ either. Certainly, there may have been those who desired to hear that were from the other nations of peoples, but nothing like that when Christ returns and delivers the nations from the enemy, Satan. Thus, the many people are from other Gentile nations that will have the desire and encourage others to do the same, that is, to go up and worship Jesus where he would be present in Israel, giving his law. Therefore, the idea is that they will come from all around the world, every nation, to worship Jesus. Thus, in doing so, it would mean that from the various, using the various forms of transportation, that would be necessary. Today, of course, due to some conflicts in areas where that is not possible at all, having a large group of nations present and traveling during the times of today, where there are maybe threats, bomb threats, wars, and so on and so forth. The travel to such a degree from every nation would signal terrorists to accomplish their goals, especially those who might be against Israel. And Israel currently is involved in some type of fighting So this would have to be when there is peace in the world because the Prince of Peace had come, and he is, of course, the King of Kings. Therefore, when Jesus returns to set up his earthly reign on earth, he will be declared the King of Kings, and that is why so many nations will learn of him and go to such a place to worship him. It also specifies which house it would be, the house of the God of Jacob. Thus, when it states that it is the house of the God of Jacob, it refers to it as being God's house. Jacob, he was one that did worship God. The same, it identifies whose God it is, or when Jacob was alive on earth, the same God that was being worshipped by him will also be worshipped by many nations around the world. In essence, we know this is Jesus Christ, and it is also God's house. It refers to which God, for during that time many had worshipped gods. So it indicates for all to know to whom the nations would come and worship, not a God of other nations, but the one and the only true God. And during, of course, the time of Jacob, that is the God that Jacob worshipped. So it would be the same God that nations would come and worship at his house, and it would be Jesus Christ, for he is the one that will return and set up his earthly kingdom. Thus, there is encouragement to go by others expressing their desire to be there and to give the invitation to others to join in the worship of Jesus and in learning of him. The other expressions are the fact that they will learn of the ways of God, of course, and that is the Jesus Christ. The Old Testament rituals and commands having to do with the animal sacrifice and so on will not be done. Jesus will teach what he had done for humanity. Further, he will be able to explain to the people in much more detail and much more freely without having to use parables or proverbs, but as he promised to speak plainly the ways of God to the nations. Moreover, those who decide to go up and worship him will also be walking in those types of precepts, concepts, and commandments that Jesus will provide to the people. That which comes out of Zion at that time will not essentially be the Mosaic Law in its entirety, but he will explain more, even any laws that Jesus may provide for other nations too, and not just the nation of Israel. It will be for the law of all for all nations. The moral law of the Old Testament, of course, will remain the same, but it will include so much more for it to be to all nations. Of course, Israel back then received a law that is a basis or can be a basis for other nations to follow suit. But when Jesus comes back, of course, there will be so many other nations, other cultures, but the law will come forth from Zion and be refined to include all nations of the world. And his righteousness and law will be commended, and as it states, to those who desire to go up to the house of God, to walk in his paths as he has directed or will direct for mankind. The word of the Lord, of course, is powerful, is sharper than any two-edged sword. Jesus will also use the Old and New Testaments to explain his commands to the people, for it, of course, is forever established. In verse number 4 it says, "And he shall judge among the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." As the nations come up to worship him, Jesus will also judge the nations. And here, as it states, many people shall be rebuked for their deeds. They desire to go there, they get rebuked, so that they will do that which is righteous and that which is not against God. That maybe that which was done in the past by the nations and the way to fix or amend also all of their constitutions to reflect a constitution, of course, that would put Jesus Christ in it. The nations would be those who would affirm their commitment to the service and worship of the King of Kings. And of course, to beat their swords into plowshares means that they will no longer learn warfare. And just a note on this, what the Pharisees and teachers of the law and scribes and many of those people who did not accept Jesus Christ as the Christ, the Messiah, they thought that he would become their king and uh, get the Roman power out. But when he comes back in his millennial reign, here it refers to that he will bring peace to the nations, not warfare. And so, of course, before that, he would be coming down from heaven, and that will trigger an intense warfare in Armageddon. But after that, his teaching will be not to fight nation against nation. So that means that they will no longer learn warfare, nor will the Asian nations as a whole put into their defense budgets money to serve to make weapons or warfare. Nations will no longer learn to fight nor go to fight with other nations. Instead, they will follow exactly when Jesus states what they would do. And part of that teaching is to go and to forego warfare, learn to be humble, learn to be attentive to the needs of the nations. No longer will there be a need for soldiers or so. It will be taught, for the soldiers are the ones who carry their swords, so to speak, so they instead will be put into work and not into fighting. That includes investing in work, even in agriculture, and the trade between nations would be extremely effective. For would include nations, excuse me, include nations that would adhere to the principles that Jesus' law lays down rather than trying to fight, disrupt, or cause any disturbances to any country in any way. This is also a prophecy of the fact that basically the bills for defense, and that means monif- and that means monetary efforts will not, by the governments of the nations, be put towards any defense, nor having any more soldiers, nor purchasing or creating any weapons for the destruction of mankind. All weapons will be dismantled, gotten rid of. Guns will not be used for the purpose of killing others. Of course, the question might be posed of whether guns will be used for killing animals and whether animals at all will be killed. Of course, during the lifetime of Jesus on earth, fish were caught, killed for eating. Therefore, the slaughter of animals may still occur, but killing other human beings in any way, of course, will not be tolerated by any persons or any country. Thus, the teachers of others will be focused on that which brings about construction, encouragement to peace, doing good one for another. Therefore, teaching will be enhanced and encouraged to do that which is beneficial for people. One can imagine that the number of teachers would increase to a much greater number. The number of births of children would increase all around the world. Salaries would be enhanced. Government of Jesus Christ would be not something to be voted on, but it would be something that would remain for the entire millennial reign of Christ. Thus, there would be so many occupational changes to countries, for they would not learn warfare nor put up monies towards defense, weaponry, or trying to learn how to make better weapons, for peace will reign and warfare will not reign. Furthermore, teaching will be focused on other areas such as mm, maybe travel, and of course, God, enhancing and focusing on Jesus Christ, one could imagine. And then that travel would be freely done between all countries so that no one, so that one can assume that travel would increase beyond anything ever seen before. For people might want not only to travel to Israel to worship Jesus Christ as a desire, but also to many other countries. Death would not take place, disease would be gotten rid of. That means hospitals would not be so common if they were needed at all. From Jesus would come healing and virtue, along with those who are part of the church doing the work in many different areas. Thus, the saints will be those who judge, be kings and priests, and rule with Christ during the most prosperous time period in the history of mankind. Verse 5 says, O house of Jacob, come ye, and let us walk in the light of the Lord. Therefore, the house of Jacob, the ones who the majority of the people, that is, the religious people of times past, had rejected and crucified Jesus, will have a great change. There will be a call to walk in the light of the Lord from then on. The call for the nations will have taken place, but this is likewise for the call to the house of Jacob and those that are Jews to come and worship Jesus, but also to walk in the ways that Jesus will teach them. By that time, of course, Israel will have seen the mistake that their forefathers have made by crucifying their Messiah and in rejecting him. The other nations had come into the fold. Thus the church started, and throughout the church, they will be the ones who will rule and reign with Christ. In verse number 6 says, Therefore thou hast forsaken thy people, the house of Jacob, because they be replenished from the east, and are soothsayers like the Philistines, and they please themselves in the children of strangers. The thou in this verse refers to God. The reason why God had forsaken his people, the house of Jacob, was because they had done what the following words say about them. God had made a covenant with them as a people, but the Jews had forsaken the Lord and his ways. So he turned to other nations of people and started a people called after his name. Thus, with that covenant with the church, they will rule and reign with Christ. The people of Israel had become soothsayers, that is, not telling the truth of things that were going to happen in the future, and using the word of the Lord. Rather, they were like the Philistines, as it says. That, of course, were foretelling events, but these were because of their relationship with evil spirits rather than the Spirit of God. Furthermore, the Israelites had delighted themselves with children of strangers, and that is, those who did not serve God, but they had other gods. Thus, they were fellowshipping with those of other nations as people, not just the Philistines, but also other countries as people, and pleasing themselves and having a relationship with them. The result, the result of said relationship was that the strangers had introduced other gods to them, and they willingly began serving those other gods, which was contrary to the law of Moses. In verse number 7, it says, Their land also is full of silver and gold, neither is there any end of their treasures. Their land is also full of horses, neither is there any end of their chariots. With this thought of many horses, chariots, silver and gold and treasures, seems like they had everything. Now, if this is speaking of the time in the past, or is this speaking of the time of when Jesus will come back? Of course, when Jesus comes back, yes, it will be true. Their land will be full of silver and gold, and no end of their treasures, full of horses, no end of their chariots. But if this is speaking about the time of um, Israel in the Old Testament, it seems like this kind of coincides with the Laodicean church. They were full, they were calling themselves rich, they had everything that they needed to defend their country, and they were basically in need of nothing. But their relationship with God is what they needed. Their fellowship with other nations, according to their mindset, might have also brought in those things to a certain degree, insomuch that they were no longer dependent on God or glorified God. For God had warned them not to serve other gods, which they seemingly were doing, the more that they had fellowship with people from other nations. Thus, the abundance of silver, gold, and treasures would allow them to do basically as they wished, as their dependence on God had waned. Instead of serving God with more sacrifices, they began using the silver and gold for the production of idols, just as those who were strangers would have inspired them to do so. However, that was going against the law of Moses and the commandments that God had instructed of them. So we turn to verse number 8. And verse number 8 says, their land also is full of idols. They worship the work of their own hands, that which their own fingers have made. This is where the treasures were going to. It was headed in the direction of idolatry, soothsaying, meaning foretelling with the evil spirits his message, and worshiping the idols, which of course had evil spirits behind each one. They developed their own idols like the idols of the nations, and that was making the Lord God of heaven angry with them and their works that they had been doing. Here it shows that they had made those idols, putting in time and effort, money and plans into making them, and putting them in a certain location, either in the town or even in their own homes or outside of their homes, for the people to prostrate themselves to those idols. Thus, they had succumbed to the temptation of doing so, the putting of their efforts and time, plus their monetary gains, all to worship and influence others within their own community to do the same. That was, according to the law of Moses, something that needed to be eradicated from the Israelites. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 13, 1 to 5 says the following: If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or wonder, and the sign or wonder or the wonder come to pass whereof he spake unto thee, saying, Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them, thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God proveth you to know whether ye love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. Ye shall walk after the Lord your God, and fear him, and keep his commandments, and obey his voice. And ye shall serve him, and cleave unto him. And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, to thrust thee out of the way which the Lord thy God commanded thee to walk in. So shalt thou put the evil away from the midst of thee. Thus the end of such should have been capital punishment. But it seems that what they were allowing um, people to do was to make their own idols and to worship and serve them, and not give anyone capital punishment. However, God would, in essence, deal with them in the end, of course. That turns us to verse number 9 it says, "And the mean man boweth down, and the great man humbleth himself, therefore forgive them not." The Amplified Version has in place of mean man the common man, which means any person rather than those that who are of the royal line or nobility. This humbling in this case does not refer to humbling oneself before God, for that would bring about a reward. Instead, this is humbling of oneself before the idols that they had made. Thus, God in this word says, in essence, the punishment for those who were to bow down to idols in the Old Testament was capital punishment, and that those who were bowing down to the idols would not be forgiven for it. And so the common man or the mean man and the great man, both categories, the great man possibly the nobility, the aristocracy, those of royal family, humbling themselves before the idols, they were not to be forgiven, as it says here, but that means that they should receive capital punishment. Verse 10 it says, "Enter into the rock, and hide thee in the dust, for fear of the Lord, and for the glory of his majesty." The judgment of the Lord would come upon the Israelites because they had turned to idolatry. Thus, the others who served the Lord were to enter into the rock. That is, they were to hide themselves in possibly the caves of the earth to escape that judgment, according to commentaries. And they were, in a different way, to hide themselves in the dust. In other words, meaning somewhere in the ground so that they could um, escape the judgment that was coming to them. And that the wrath and the judgment of God was coming upon the people for doing such things. May God bless you today in the name of Jesus.